let's start with the China thing. So as I was mentioning before, Red Spectre on GitHub. It's red-spectre. Doing some great work, and if we look a little more closely at their page here, down on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a bunch of different articles that they've put together against Dengism, against MAGA communism, against Trotskyism, some things about Albania, actually the successes of Albanian socialism, and so on. So today, I'd like to read their article against Dengism, which of course refers to Deng Xiaoping, the long-term leader in China after the death of Mao Zedong, who reintroduced capitalism in a major way, the quote, opening up market reforms that were maybe not so good. So let's see. The table of contents here is going to cover the following topics. Is China socialist? But it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's socialism adapted to local conditions. That's one of the claims that you hear. But China kills billionaires. Why would a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie do that? What about poverty reduction? Isn't it just like Lenin's NEP? Which, in other words, a limited reintroduction of capitalism temporarily. And when discussing productive forces, we cannot forget the relations of production. So these are some of the topics we're going to get into. Let's start with, is China socialist? So, beginning, is China socialist? This can be answered by the question, does capital exist in China? According to Lenin and Stalin, starting with a Lenin quote from The State, we have it on the channel, it's a lecture that Lenin gave in 1919 at the Sverdlov University, quote, I have already advised you to turn for help to Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. This book says that every state in which private ownership of the land and means of production exists, in which capital dominates, however democratic it may be, is a capitalist state, a machine used by the capitalists to keep the working class and the poor peasants in subjection, while universal suffrage, a constituent assembly, a parliament are merely a form, a sort of promissory note which does not change the real state of affairs. The forms of domination of the state may vary. Capital manifests its power in one way where one form exists, and in another way where another form exists. But essentially, the power is in the hands of capital, whether there are voting qualifications or some other rights or not, or whether the republic is a democratic one or not. In fact, the more democratic it is, cruder and more cynical is the rule of capitalism. One of the most democratic republics in the world is the United States of America, yet nowhere, and those who have been there since 1905 probably know it, is the power of capital, the power of a handful of multimillionaires over the whole of society, so crude and so openly corrupt as in America. Once capital exists, it dominates the whole of society, and no democratic republic, no franchise, can change its nature. So again, that's quoting from Lenin's The State, 1919. Now, I want to make the qualification on that one that, of course, Lenin here is talking about pre-revolutionary, so just existing bourgeois states that haven't had a proletarian revolution yet, and basically saying that you can't make it not capitalism just by changing the form of the government or introducing more democracy. However, does the converse hold true? In other words, if you have had a proletarian revolution, but then reintroduce capital, well, as it says, once capital exists, it dominates the whole of society. No democratic republic, no franchise or right to vote can change its nature. Well, can the alleged dictatorship of the proletariat even hold it in check? And of course, this is the position that is commonly put around today by people who do defend China for being socialist, is that, they've got it under control. That was probably the major point to me where I started becoming more skeptical of this. At first I accepted it. Then when I saw more of the extent of how capital has actually grown in China over the last 45 years since the market reforms and the opening up and all of that stuff, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. At what point does it, escape the control if in fact it, even was in control in the first place? But anyway, continuing, now we have a Stalin quote. This is from Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Quote, "It is said that commodity production must lead, is bound to lead, to capitalism all the same under all conditions. That is not true. Not always and not under all conditions. Commodity production must not be identified with capitalist production. They're two different things. Capitalist production is the highest form of commodity production. Commodity production leads to capitalism only if there is private ownership of the means of production, if labor power appears in the market as a commodity which can be bought by the capitalist and exploited in the process of production, and if, consequently, the system of exploitation of wage workers by capitalists exists in the country. Capitalist production begins when the means of production are concentrated in private hands and when the workers are bereft of the means of production and are compelled to sell their labor power as a commodity. Without this, there is no such thing as capitalist production." End of the quote. And in order to confirm the existence of capital, we quote from Marx, Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 33, "We know that the means of production and subsistence, while they remain the property of the immediate producer, are not capital. They become capital only under circumstances in which they serve at the same time as means of exploitation and subjection of the laborer. So long, therefore, as the laborer can accumulate for himself, and this he can do so long as he remains possessor of his means of production, capitalist accumulation and the capitalistic mode of production are impossible. The class of wage laborers, essential to these, is wanting." Considering the fact that China not only allows wage exploitation, but has either the most or second most billionaires of any country on earth, it is safe to say that capital exists. Hence, it cannot be socialist. To address some counter-arguments to this. So, first, but they keep their capitalists under control, or they kill capitalists, but China is a dictatorship of the proletariat. So, in response, 4 points. 1, none of these is correct. 2, we already established that capital exists. We also established that capital always takes control of any state or society it exists in, given enough time, no exceptions. It follows that China cannot be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and finally, this argument will be given more detail below in its own category. So, it's per capita, okay, but this is irrelevant and dishonest. I brought up the amount of the abundance of billionaires not because my point depended on it, but to point to the severity of the situation in China, to prove that it's not young capital, but rather already developed late-stage capital. In this situation, it is impossible not to admit that capital has already taken control of society long ago. Using the per capita argument, like billionaires per capita, that kind of thing, tries to invalidate this position in the spirit of they might be on that terrible list, and they might score high on that terrible list. But it doesn't matter because of this other terrible list that they're on, in which they are, quote, only above Brazil and Kuwait and below the world average. So regardless, they still have a lot of billionaires, which have a lot of wealth, and this fact stands. More on this below. They also still compare disfavorably in these metrics to India, which by all accounts is capitalist. So if India is capitalist, then why wouldn't China be? And then there's the other point. It's like the NEP, and this will be addressed below. So on the point, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's adapted to local conditions. That's why, it has these things that look like capitalism, but you just don't understand. This is just how the Chinese have to do it because of their situation. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, or SWCC for short, does not exist. Quoting Stalin from the conversation with the delegation of the CCCP of China in Moscow, we have this one on the channel, quote, "You speak of Sinified socialism. There is nothing of the sort in nature. There is no Russian, English, French, German, Italian socialism, as much as there is no Chinese socialism. There is only one Marxist-Leninist socialism. It is another thing that in the building of socialism, it is necessary to take into consideration the specific features of a particular country. Socialism is a science, necessarily having, like all science, certain general laws, and one just needs to ignore them, and the building of socialism is destined to failure. Unquote. When taking into account the local conditions, the end goal still remains the same. If we wish to reach from beginning to end, or in the chart below B to E, regardless of what C, conditions, we have in the middle, we find a way to get past them, or utilize them if they're helpful, and proceed. We take into consideration C, conditions, then we set a course from beginning, or starting point of development, to end, building socialism. We take into consideration the national conditions, C, set a course from feudalism, B, or capitalism, B, depending on where you're starting from, to socialism, E, the end, and reach the one type of socialism that is real. So no matter where you're starting from, and no matter what the conditions are, you're still going to that same point in the end. All right? There's just, as Stalin said, there's just one socialism. Instead, socialism with Chinese characteristics capitulates to the national conditions and to nationalism itself, declaring that due to the conditions, they will go from B to R, revisionism. This is not considering specific futures or conditions, but just simply surrendering to them indefinitely. This is not internationalism, not socialism, it is nationalism. So the Marxist approach is B to E while planning for C, and the nationalist anti-Marxist approach is B plus C, starting conditions, or your starting mode of production plus national conditions equals revisionism. Comrade Stalin was indeed correct when he stated in the same source, quote, "As far as I know, in the Communist Party of China, there is a thin layer of the proletariat, and the nationalist sentiments are very strong. And if you do not conduct genuinely Marxist-Leninist class policies, and do not conduct struggle against bourgeois nationalism, the nationalists will strangle you. Then not only will socialist construction be terminated, but China may become a dangerous toy in the hands of the American imperialists," unquote. So next point, but they kill billionaires. Why would a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie do that? Quoting Stalin, Conversations with Soviet Economists on Fascism, quote, "A few more observations on fascist philosophy. They write as if they have socialism. This needs to be exposed in economic terms. This is what Hitler says, quote, 'The state, the people, our capitalists receive only 8%. That's enough for them. The formulation of this question needs to be accomplished by throwing light on the question of competition and the anarchy of production, with the attempts of the capitalists to get rid of competition with the help of the theory of ultra-imperialism. It must be demonstrated that they are doomed.'" So for people who don't know, ultra-imperialism was the revisionist theory of German SPD leader Karl Kautsky and major opponent of Lenin, who Lenin wrote against many, many times. And ultra-imperialism basically says that the world wars will eventually stop, the imperialists will come to an agreement, there will be like peaceful imperialism. Continuing, "It must be demonstrated that they are doomed. They are propagating a corporatist system, as if it is above the class of workers and the capitalists, and the state cares and looks after the workers. They are even arresting individual capitalists. It is true that Tucson could escape. One should say that in all of this, there is more of demagogy, that this is just the pressure of the bourgeois state on individual capitalists who do not want to subject themselves to class discipline. It should be mentioned once in the section on cartelization and their unsuccessful attempts at planning. Mention it again in the section on socialism. In your system, gentlemen fascists, to whom do the means of production belong? They belong to individual capitalists and to groups of capitalists, and therefore you cannot have genuine planning except for bits, as the economy is divided among groups of owners," unquote. In short, what's going on in China is bourgeois infighting, using the state against individual bourgeois who break class discipline. It is the result of the central cartel-like structure of the CPC, allowing their capitalists to be better coordinated, and to coordinate, quote, class rules, and to punish whatever capitalists breaks these rules. Much like a dictatorship of the proletariat would arrest individual workers for breaking the law, i.e. a worker state arrests and executes a worker for taking an action that helps them individually but hurts the working class as a whole, can a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie arrest individual capitalists for breaking their agreements, pact's consensus, or even just because the wrong person stands to gain from their death, i.e., a capitalist state arrests and executes a capitalist for taking a profitable action that hurts the capitalist class as a class, or a few other capitalists who are stronger. Alternatively, the execution occurs because it would be profitable to the stronger group to do so. The Communist Party of China has bad factions in it, is another claim, but Xi Jinping is fighting to restore and preserve the dictatorship of the proletariat. I've personally heard this one a lot. Like, oh no, Xi is going to rein it all back in, press the communism button, and like, etc. This is an argument I once heard on why we should support China, and it went along the lines of the Central Committee has multiple lines and trends in it, trends that are fighting against each other. In the meantime, they have a centralized economic structure that builds up the economy, and when that's done, we will reach socialism. Another one is Xi Jinping and his group are good, and they're cleansing the CPC of revisionism. But even if we accept either of these incorrect points, we reach a point where no dictatorship of the proletariat exists. If we have many lines, why aren't they purged away? Is it because the, quote, good faction isn't strong enough? This means that the bad ones control the state. Fair point. It's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Just because the group of Alexander Shelepin existed, which wanted a return to socialism and to liquidate revisionism after Khrushchev was ousted, doesn't mean that we should defend the government of Brezhnev and Kosygin. Quite the contrary, we should call for its overthrow. It matters little if it's done from within the CPSU or from without. What's important is that it's done. Once we actually see Kosygin and Brezhnev get ousted, once we see the Soviet Union authorities move to re-Stalinization, once we see Khrushchevite economic policies being reversed in deeds and not only in words, then we can declare the workers are in power, to declare that the state is a dictatorship of the working class. But the Communist Party of China shows no such signs, not even the slightest ones. Quite the contrary. China's course and Xi Jinping's speeches point to the further strengthening of the already omnipotent capital. So this is a quote by Xi Jinping from The Governance of China, Volume 1. I actually started reading the first few chapters of this on the channel. It was terrible. It reminded me of it was like travel brochures or something. It was just utter fluff and total PR. Somebody in the comments referred to it as 3 graduation speeches in a trench coat. Anyway, somebody else asked me, did I regret reading it? No, I read 3 chapters and stopped, and I don't regret knowing that it sucked. That's a good thing to know. Anyway, quote, reform and opening up is always ongoing and will never end. Reform and opening up is a long-term and arduous cause, and people need to work on it generation after generation. We should carry out reform to improve the socialist market economy of China and adhere to the basic state policy of opening up to the outside world. We must further reform in key sectors with greater political courage and vision, and forge ahead steadily in the direction determined by the party's 18th National Congress, the invisible hand and the visible hand. We should let the market play the decisive role in allocating resources, while allowing the government to better perform its functions. This is a theoretical and practical issue of great importance. A correct and precise understanding of this issue is very important to further the reform and promote the sound and orderly development of the socialist market economy. We should make good use of the roles of both the market, the quote, invisible hand, and the government, the quote, visible hand. The market and the government should complement and coordinate with each other to promote sustained and sound social and economic development. Then there's another section, revolutionize energy production and consumption. Fourth, we must revolutionize the energy market. We will proceed with reform, restore energy's status as a commodity, build a system of workable competition, and put in place a mechanism in which energy prices are largely driven by the market. In addition, we will change the way that the government supervises the energy industry and establish and improve the legal framework for energy development. And that's the end of the quote. I think we can all see how the reform needing generations more, how the market should play the decisive role in allocating resources, and how energy should be treated as a commodity, making an ironic mockery to Lenin's Golero plan, instead of electrification being the condition to move on from the market and to embrace a planned economy, electricity becomes just another tool of it. Yeah, it is really mind-boggling. Just another commodity to buy and sell. It suffices to disprove the above-mentioned liberal notions. What is a pro-market person doing in such a high position, if not serving the interests of the bourgeoisie? In other words, who's going to really benefit and gain from that? Lenin once said, quote, "Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country." That's quoting from Our Foreign and Domestic Position and Party Tasks. But it seems that, quote, "comrade bourgeoisie" does not agree with Lenin. Who is Lenin anyway? Instead, we're supposed to believe communism minus Soviet power equals electrification of the whole country. That's good. Perhaps that is the reason why they plagiarize our symbols as such. What about poverty reduction? This is another point. China's reducing poverty. I mean, so did the New Deal. But why does a country with more GDP per capita, i.e. per person, than the USSR still have poverty? Furthermore, why does rent still exist? Both Dengists and anti-Dengists have likely already grown tired of the billionaire debate. But what about the landlords? Capitalists, like under the NEP, can, quote, contribute to society, using the term loosely. But what do landlords do except for creating poverty and raising house prices? Nothing. It reminds me of the meme, I'm a landlord, I make my living hoarding housing. Hence, no self-proclaimed communist will ever try to justify the existence of landlords or to claim that they produce anything. Allowing the existence of parasites who contribute nothing and hold homes for ransom is, by itself, terrible. But what happens when a large part of society can't afford basic rent? The average rent in Beijing at the time of writing is 7,485 yuan per month. At the cheapest district in Beijing, it is 2,377. Around 11% of the city earns between 2,000 to 3,000 per month. Taxes and basics not included. Another 12.5% earns between 3,000 and 4,500. The average Dengist will try to downplay this thing, claiming it's not that bad or other places have it worse. The former is incorrect. The latter is irrelevant and probably incorrect too. Private rent existing in China, a developed country which again has more GDP per capita than the USSR, is by itself bad enough. How costly the rent is just makes it worse. And it's also reflective, I would add, to China being part of global capitalist trends in general, because that is happening in many places with advanced capitalism around the world right now. So it actually seems to suggest, on its face at least, that China is more in step with what global capitalism is doing than pulling out of that situation where the country is for sale. All right, but isn't what China's doing just like Lenin's NEP? No. To explain why not, we need to explain two things about the NEP. What was it, and why was it needed? The NEP was a strategic retreat on the economic front. A sharp transition to socialism was attempted due to the circumstances of the Civil War and invasion by foreign powers. When the USSR was invaded by Czechoslovakia, UK, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, the latter four as UK colonies, the USA, Italy, France, Japan, Greece, Estonia, Serbia, Poland, Finland, the alternative incident, Finland again, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia backed by German soldiers, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and probably more. This is based only on bourgeois sources that aim to downplay such events. So the USSR was under massive, massive attack. So they did a strategic retreat into capitalism, and it wound up only lasting like 6 years. So anyway, this policy, according to Lenin, failed. Lenin, writing in the New Economic Policy, said, quote, "Of course, tasks on the economic front are much more difficult than tasks on the war front, although there is a general similarity between the two elementary outlines of strategy. In attempting to go over straight to communism, we, in the spring of 1921, sustained a more serious defeat on the economic front than any defeat inflicted upon us by Kolchak, Denikin, or Pilsudski. This defeat was much more serious, significant, and dangerous. It was expressed in the isolation of the higher administrators of our economic policy from the lower and their failure to produce that development of the productive forces, which the program of our party regards as vital and urgent, unquote. The NEP was the correct line to fix these mistakes and work to build socialism, emphasis on build. There were a few reasons for its necessity, and we will go into some. So before we go into that screen, just to clarify my comment. So the policy of trying to go straight over into socialism failed. And so the strategic retreat into capitalism was necessary. However, as I was adding, although perhaps prematurely, even this policy was very short-lived. Economically, it did achieve the results that were needed. Politically, it didn't work out, or I guess you could say even socially, it didn't work out as well. It saved them economically from the problems that Lenin was just describing. It also created somewhat serious, really grave social problems, and we'll probably discuss that in a second. But anyway, as far as the reasons for the necessity of this temporary strategic retreat, here we go. 1, large quantity of peasants in the country, as it had only recently freed itself from feudalism. So quoting Lenin from the same source again, the new economic policy means substituting a tax for the direct requisitioning of food. It means reverting to capitalism to a considerable extent. To what extent, we don't know. Concessions to foreign capitalists, it's true, only very few have been accepted, especially when compared with the number we have offered. And leasing enterprises to private capitalists definitely mean restoring capitalism, and this is part and parcel of the new economic policy. For the abolition of the surplus food appropriation system means allowing the peasants to trade freely in their surplus agricultural produce in whatever is left over after the tax is collected. And the tax, it takes only a small share of that produce. The peasants constitute a huge section of our population and of our entire economy, and that is why capitalism must grow out of this soil of free trading, unquote. 2, the abundance of small production and an absence of large-scale production. So quoting from Lenin's The Tax in Kind, let us enumerate these elements, the economic elements existing in 1921 Russia. 1, there are patriarchal elements, i.e., to a considerable extent, natural peasant farming. 2, small commodity production. This includes the majority of those peasants who sell their grain. 3, there is private capitalism. 4, there's state capitalism. And 5, there is socialism. Russia is so vast and so varied that all these different types of socioeconomic structures are intermingled. This is what constitutes the specific feature of the situation. So the question arises, what elements predominate? Clearly, in a small peasant country, the petty bourgeois element predominates, and it must predominate. For the great majority, those working the land, are small commodity producers. The shell of state capitalism, the grain monopoly, the state-controlled entrepreneurs and traders, the bourgeois cooperators, is pierced now in one place, now in another by profiteers, the chief object of profiteering being grain. It is not state capitalism that it is at war with socialism, but the petty bourgeoisie plus private capitalism fighting together against state capitalism and socialism, unquote. And by the way, we have that piece, The Tax in Kind, on the channel, and basically Lenin is saying that they could kind of handle the state capitalists more easily. It was these smaller wildcat profiteers that were giving some of the worst problems. And so the goal was like they made stricter penalties on the profiteering, and then they allowed them to legally do some non-profiteering trade. So they're like, look, we'll let you trade, we'll let you profit a little bit, but the penalties on profiteering just went up. So they're trying to bring it under control. Because of this, planning the economy was extremely hard and ineffective. Through state capitalism, the economy could function and set up the apparatus needed for socialism, which would then take over. Quoting Lenin again from the same work, at present, petty bourgeois capitalism prevails in Russia, and it is one and the same road that leads from it to both large-scale state capitalism and to socialism, through one and the same intermediary station called national accounting and control of production and distribution. Those who fail to understand this are committing an unpardonable mistake in economics. Either they don't know the facts of life, do not see what actually exists, and are unable to look the truth in the face, or they confine themselves to abstractly comparing, quote, socialism with capitalism, and fail to study the concrete forms and stages of the transition that is taking place in our country, unquote. So Lenin is basically saying it's not as simple as just socialism versus capitalism. You have to look at the particular kinds of capitalist activity which were most reactionary, most fighting the building of socialism. And he made a great argument, I think, in this piece that the state capitalism that actually existed at the time of the revolution was way closer to socialism. It was more stable. It had the advanced accounting. It was more easily controlled. It just wasn't as big of a threat to what they were trying to do. So they couldn't snap their fingers and do it at once, but they were trying as rapidly as possible year by year to get the system under control and to go back into the building of socialism. However, as the earlier efforts in 1921 has showed, if they were to just keep doing that, they would lose everything. They would have massive economic losses and no socialism in the end. So they had to do these intermediate steps to get themselves there as quickly as possible. So another thing is the backward state of the productive forces. In other words, it is not that the Bolsheviks, quote, chose capitalism, but that they had to put up with it as the only practical course of action that they had in that moment. So quoting Lenin again, what is the policy that the socialist proletariat can pursue in the face of this economic reality? Is it to give the small peasant all he needs of the goods produced by large-scale socialist industries in exchange for his grain and raw materials? This would be the most desirable and, quote, correct policy, and we have started on it, but we cannot supply all the goods, very far from it, nor shall we be able to do so very soon. At all events, not until we complete the first stage of the electrification of the whole country, which was not even complete at that time. So what is to be done? One way is to try to prohibit entirely, to put the lock on all development of private, non-state exchange, i.e. trade, i.e. capitalism, which is inevitable with millions of small producers, which is the situation that they were faced with at that time. But such a policy would be foolish and suicidal for the party that tried to apply it. It would be foolish because it's economically impossible. It would be suicidal because the party that tried to apply it would meet with inevitable disaster. Let's admit it. Some communists have sinned in thought, word, and deed by adopting such a policy. We shall try to rectify these mistakes, and this must be done without fail. Otherwise, things will come to a very sorry state. The alternative, and this is the only sensible and the last possible policy, is not to try to prohibit or put the lock on the development of capitalism, but to channel it into state capitalism. In other words, the form that he found more easy to control. This is economically possible, for state capitalism exists in varying form and degree wherever there are elements of unrestricted trade and capitalism in general, unquote. Notice how Lenin states the alternative of the NEP. Fighting against capitalism is suicidal in their situation at that time due to the above 2 points, neither of which exist in China, which can and should use the more correct policy due to being far beyond just the first stage of electrification, which is one of the things holding Lenin and the Bolsheviks back. So that's not the situation in China, and this brings the author to their next point. 4, electrification, the most underrated factor in play in terms of the NEP and why China is China's not in the kind of situation now which necessitated the NEP in 1920s very early USSR or Soviet Russia. So quoting Lenin again, is an immediate transition to socialism from the state of affairs predominating now in Russia conceivable? Yes, it is, to a certain degree, but on one condition, the precise nature of which we now know thanks to a great piece of scientific work that has been completed. That is electrification. If we construct scores of district electric power stations, we now know where and how these can and should be constructed, and transmit electric power to every village. If we obtain a sufficient number of electric motors and other machinery, we shall not need or shall hardly need any transition stages or intermediary links between patriarchalism and socialism. But we know perfectly well that it will take at least 10 years only to complete the first stage of this one condition. This period can be conceivably reduced only if the proletarian revolution is victorious in such countries as Britain, Germany, or the USA, unquote. So just a comment there, it actually lasted less than a decade, partly because while Lenin died, Then there was, within the group of Bolsheviks, lack of clarity on how to move forward. There were also some social problems resulting from the NEP because the new NEP men, these capitalists, were becoming counter-revolutionary. There were a lot of problems coming out of that, and there was sort of a need to push ahead with socialism sort of anyway, just due to the sort of political and social considerations generated by that. But anyway, stating clearly as day that the transition would be sharp and sudden if only they had electricity was the thing that originally convinced me that the NEP was necessary. It showed just how backward, just how hard the situation was in post-revolution, pre-USSR Russia. Between these, the Civil War, the invasions, World War I, the famine, and the SRs and Mensheviks fighting against Soviet power, one can understand the NEP in its historical context. Basically had like almost a decade of just solid war. If tiny Albania could move to socialism with much less wealth or technology, without cutting-edge supercomputers and modern nuclear power plants, why can't modern China? Besides, how long did the NEP take? Around 7 years, 4 of war and 3 of peace, compared to the Chinese reforms, now in its 46th year. I would justify 5 years of NEP peace, 7 years, 10 years, hell, even 15 I could somehow understand. But even if we ignore Mao completely, Deng Xiaoping's reforms have been in place for over 40 years. So the next thing, if capital must take control of the state, why did the USSR survive the NEP and continued socialist construction? So this should be interesting. It's kind of what I was talking about. It almost didn't. And in fact, it caused arguably a calamity within the Bolshevik group. But the unsatisfying answer would be dictatorship of the proletariat and its short time frame. But equally as important to this are the measures taken to prevent capital from attaining omnipotence. So quoting Lenin from The State and Revolution, at present, imperialism and the domination of the banks have developed into an exceptional art, both these methods of upholding and giving effect to the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions. Another reason why the omnipotence of wealth is more certain in a democratic republic is that it does not depend on defects in the political machinery or on the faulty political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell through the Palchinskys, Chernovs, Tseretellis and company, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic state can shake it." Unquote. A big measure taken by the Bolsheviks to that end, and one which is imperative when using state capitalism to build socialism, was the foreign trade monopoly. In relation to a resolution that relaxed this monopoly, and luckily was never carried out, Lenin requested the matter to be postponed, and the trade monopoly was affirmed. In 1922, it was discussed when Lenin couldn't attend. So he remarked in a letter to Stalin for the members of the CCRCPB on the foreign trade monopoly, quote, "In actual fact, however, this wrecks the foreign trade monopoly. Small wonder that Comrade Sokolnikov has been trying to get this done and has succeeded. He has always been for it. He likes paradoxes and has always undertaken to prove that monopoly is not to our advantage. But it is surprising that people who in principle favor the monopoly have voted for this without asking for detailed information from any of the business executives. What does the decision that has been adopted signify? Purchasing offices are being opened for the import and export trade. The owner of such an office has the right to buy and sell only specifically listed goods. Where is the control over this? Where are the means of control? In Russia, flax costs 4 rubles, 50 kopecks. In Britain, it costs 14 rubles. All of us have read in Capital how capitalism changes internally and grows more daring when interest rates and profits rise quickly. All of us recall that capitalism is capable of taking deadly risks, and that Marx recognized this long before the war and before capitalism began its, quote, leaps. What is the situation now? What force is capable of holding the peasants and the traders from extremely profitable deals? Cover Russia with a network of overseers? Catch the neighbor in a purchasing office and prove that his flax has been sold to be smuggled out of the country? Comrade Sokolnikov's paradoxes are always clever, but one must distinguish between paradoxes and the grim truth. I propose that the decision on this question be deferred for 2 months, i.e. until the next plenary meeting. In the interim, information and verified documents on the experience of our trade policy should be collected. PPS, I've just been informed for an hour and a half that some business executives have applied for a postponement. I have not yet read this application, but I wholeheartedly support it. It is only a matter of 2 months, unquote. And to refute a myth before the Trotskyists create it, Stalin agreed with this point. Quoting from the results of the 13th Congress of the RCPB, fifthly, the Congress reaffirmed the inviolability of our monopoly of foreign trade. I do not think that there is any need to explain the importance of the foreign trade monopoly for our industry and agriculture, as well as for the bond between the two. Its cardinal significance requires no fresh proof. See the resolution on the Central Committee's report, unquote. China has consistently liberalized their foreign trade laws. In 2004, quote, fully liberalizing access to foreign trade operations. According to the Foreign Trade Law of the People's Republic of China that was revised in 2004, starting from July 2004, foreign trade dealers only need to register with the authority responsible and no longer have to ask for approval from the Chinese government. This change has facilitated the diversification of China's foreign trade entities, consisting of state-owned, foreign-invested, and private enterprises. The imports and exports of state-owned and foreign-owned enterprises have maintained sustained growth, while private enterprises have seen their foreign trade develop rapidly, and their share of China's import and export market keeps expanding, becoming key players in China's foreign trade. In 2010, the import and export volume of state-owned enterprises, foreign-invested enterprises, and private enterprises in the country's total was 20.9%, 53.8%, and 25.3% respectively, unquote. Not only allowing private foreign trade, but having 25% of it be private, more than that of the SOEs, cannot but create this omnipotence of capital, leading to its taking control of the republic. So next point, when discussing productive forces, we cannot forget the relations of production. The most adamant of the defenders of the, quote, Communist Party of China speak about productive forces so much that it became a meme. In truth, however, everyone using the productive forces argument to defend the exploitative Chinese state reveal a schism which eclipses the distance between Pluto and the sun, a schism between themselves and anything Marxist. Instead of Marxists and Leninists, honest proponents of such ideas ought to use the term Yaroshenkoists. Quoting Stalin in Economic Problems in the USSR, quote, to describe Comrade Yaroshenko's opinion in a couple of words, it should be said that it is un-Marxist and hence profoundly erroneous. Comrade Yaroshenko's chief error is that he forsakes the Marxist position on the question of the role of the productive forces and of the relations of production in the development of society, that he inordinately overrates the role of the productive forces and just as inordinately underrates the role of the relations of production, and ends up by declaring that under socialism, the relations of production are a component part of the productive forces, unquote. And this issue of paying too much attention to the productive forces, material capacity to produce, like better factories, while giving too little attention to the relations of production, like who owns these factories, a lord, a capitalist, the factory workers, the state, if it's the latter, who owns the state, leads to the ridiculous idea, quoting from the same source, that here, according to Comrade Yaroshenko, the relations of production lose every vestige of an independent role. They cease to be a serious factor of development and are absorbed by the productive forces, becoming a component part of them. Under socialism, Comrade Yaroshenko says, quote, men's production relations become part of the organization of the productive forces as a means, an element of their organization. If that's so, what is the chief task of the political economy of socialism? Comrade Yaroshenko replies, the chief problem of the political economy of socialism, therefore, is not to investigate the relations of production of the members of socialist society, it is to elaborate and develop a scientific theory of the organization of the productive forces in social production, a theory of the planning of economic development. He plainly declares that in his political economy of socialism, quote, disputes as to the role of any particular category of socialist political economy, value, commodity, money, credit, etc., which very often with us are of a scholastic character, are replaced by a healthy discussion of the rational organization of the productive forces in social production, by a scientific demonstration of the validity of such organization, unquote. And all of this leads to a complete disregard of the relations of production. Quoting it again, Comrade Yaroshenko thinks that it is enough to arrange a, quote, rational organization of the productive forces, and the transition from socialism to communism will take place without any particular difficulty. He considers that this is quite sufficient for the transition to communism. He plainly declares that, quote, under socialism, the basic struggle for the building of a communist society reduces itself to a struggle for the proper organization of the productive forces and their rational utilization in social production, unquote. Comrade Yaroshenko solemnly proclaims that, quote, communism is the highest scientific organization of the productive forces in social production, unquote. And with such un-Marxist and profoundly erroneous theories, we can finally declare that no contradiction exists between a market economy and a socialist economy. Suddenly, communism is not attained by gradually doing away with the birthmarks of capitalism, by drawing the workers themselves to the process of running the economy through education, by doing away with commodities and value, and many more. Now, the process is simple. Make the factory bigger and faster using any means until you reach communism. Socialism is no longer a mode of production, but any economy that grows fast. If this sounds like a paradox to you, congratulations, you understand dialectics better than all Yaroshenkoists put together. If we declare that under socialism, the relations of production lose their importance, for example, by having a market economy when planning is possible, and pretend that advancing productive forces not only manages to preserve socialism but advance it to communism, then socialism has lost all meaning. To prove my point, the Ukrainian SSR was socialist. If we assume that once socialism is attained, the relations of production become subordinated to the productive forces, then hence a change to the relations of production, like permitting private ownership, will not change its socialist nature. Rejoice, for modern Ukraine is still socialist. If we assume that Ukraine is no longer socialist, then why? Is it because of the productive forces? Is it because herder factory grow fast under Stalin, factory grows slow under Brezhnev, factory goes kaput under Gorbachev and Yeltsin? Nonsense. It is no longer socialist because the relations of production changed despite the productive forces still growing. It is also why the growth slowed under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and why in part industry collapsed after the USSR was destroyed. This means that the relations of production never ceased to matter, that they are still highly important under socialism, which China never reached, and that excusing capitalism with productive forces cannot exist alongside scientific socialism. According to Deng Xiaoping, quoting from Deng's "We shall draw on historical experience and guard against wrong tendencies," there is no such thing as socialism and communism with poverty. The ideal of Marxists is to realize communism. According to Marx, communist society is a society in which the principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs is applied. What is the principle of to each according to his needs? How can we apply this principle without highly developed productive forces and vast material wealth? According to Marxism, communist society is a society in which there is overwhelming material abundance. Socialism is the first stage of communism. It means expanding the productive forces, and it represents a long historical period. Only if we constantly expand the productive forces can we finally achieve communism. The Gang of Four's absurd theory of socialism and communism led only to poverty and stagnation, unquote. So, does socialism mean expanding the productive forces, or is it a definite mode of production? Quoting Stalin on the draft constitution of the USSR, quote, "Principles of socialism, whose main pillars are things that have already been achieved and realized, like the socialist ownership of the land, forests, factories, works, and other instruments and means of production, the abolition of exploitation and of exploiting classes, the abolition, editor's note, abolition, not reduction, of poverty for the majority and of luxury for the minority, the abolition of unemployment, work as an obligation and as an honorable duty for every able-bodied citizen, in accordance with the formula, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. The right to work, i.e. the right of every citizen to receive guaranteed employment. The right to rest and leisure, the right to education, etc., etc. The draft of the new Constitution rests on these and similar pillars of socialism." Unquote. Deng repeats his mistake in understanding socialism multiple times. Quoting from Deng's, "We must continue to emancipate our minds and accelerate the reform," these can be summed up as the decision to build socialism suited to conditions in China. And if we are to build socialism, our fundamental task must be to develop the productive forces, shake off poverty, build a strong, prosperous country, and improve the living conditions of the people." Unquote. In conclusion, socialism is not poverty reduction or advancing productive forces. Socialism is a higher mode of production than capitalism. Socialism is a mode of production that abolishes poverty and pushes the productive forces to grow. Socialism is a mode of production. But wait, I can already see someone asking and doing their very best to avoid any of my arguments. Why must the two contradict? Give China more time to develop its productive forces, and then they will fix their relations of production. It speaks volumes about how low the communist movement fell, how much we suffered due to the Khrushchevite betrayal, that I have not only to remark on, but to anticipate such a question. Despite already showing this utopian idea sufficed for Comrade Stalin to call out Yaroshenko by name, and despite the same argument being universal and could fit for defending any regime in history, the USA, Russia, Iran, even the bloody Roman Empire, just give them time and eventually our People's Party, or liberal democracy, or benevolent God, or any other idealist rubbish will willingly liberate us. We don't have to fight. But providing a worthwhile answer to this point may at least be of some use to those who want to learn. Let's get to it. When do we know that the relations of production ought to change? We need to first understand how the relations of production interact with the productive forces and vice versa. There will be a summary underneath this quote. This is quoting Stalin in Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Quote, "The relations of production, in their turn, react upon the development of the productive forces, accelerating or retarding it. In this connection, it should be noted that the relations of production cannot for too long a time lag behind and be in a state of contradiction to the growth of the productive forces, inasmuch as the productive forces can develop in full measure only when the relations of production correspond to the character, the state of the productive forces, and allow full scope for their development." So, comment here, I hate to interrupt the Stalin quote. We were just talking about this in Dutt's Fascism and Social Revolution. There's an entire chapter about how the capitalists eventually, in imperialism, start to revolt against technology because it is pushing greater and greater crises, the increased productivity, and it's basically making capitalism obsolete as a mode of production. Like, inevitably it becomes clear that the profit seeking is an obstacle. You can't really run the high technology on that basis. Continuing, therefore, however much the relations of production may lag behind the development of the productive forces, they must sooner or later come into correspondence with, and actually do come into correspondence with, the level of development of the productive forces, the character of the productive forces. Otherwise, we would have a fundamental violation of the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production within the system of production, a disruption of production as a whole, a crisis of production, a destruction of productive forces, which again is what you get in fascism. An instance in which the relations of production do not correspond to the character of the productive forces, conflict with them, is the economic crises in capitalist countries, where private capitalist ownership of the means of production is in glaring incongruity with the social character of the process of production, with the character of the productive forces. This results in economic crises which lead to the destruction of productive forces. Furthermore, this incongruity itself constitutes the economic basis of social revolution, the purpose of which is to destroy the existing relations of production and to create new relations of production which correspond to the character of the productive forces. So at some point, in other words, like we read in the Communist Manifesto, that's the end of the quote, by the way, we read in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism is socializing production. It is taking what used to be done in lots of individual little workshops, and it's bringing people together by the hundreds and the thousands in, huge workshops. And it's also coordinating, a gear produced in this county or this country, put together with springs and sprockets from other places. So production becomes hugely socialized under capitalism, but ownership and profit and all that are not. So the means of production aren't, the ownership of the means of production are not socialized under capitalism, but the process is. And at some point, the process of production comes into such conflict with the technology that's available for production that social revolution is the only way forward. So, and again, fascism or stalled late stage advanced capitalism, advanced imperialism, it starts destroying the productive forces for exactly that reason, because if the productive forces advance, it's going to be the death of capitalism, because it will make that glaring incongruity just that much worse and the resulting crises that much worse. All right, continuing. In other words, the productive forces go first and they advance faster. The relations of production can either correspond to the productive forces or lag behind them, but not go ahead. If they correspond, the relations of production push the productive forces to advance faster. If the relations lag too far behind, they slow down the productive forces, meaning that they grow slower. If the relations lag very far behind, crisis of production occurs and the productive forces diminish. When the relations and forces do not correspond, we have something comparable to a rubber band. Imagine grabbing an indestructible rubber band from both sides and pulling it apart. The further you are, the harder it is to advance. You need to expend more effort for the same distance. You suddenly need to expend effort just to stay where you are. Eventually, one of your hands gives up. With this same principle, when the productive forces advance and the relations of production do not, there starts to exist a sort of rubber band pulling them together. The further away they are, the slower the productive forces advance. Eventually, crises start to occur, and these become, on average, worse and worse, like when the rubber band hits your hand. Eventually, either a crisis occurs and the productive forces are pulled backward by the rubber band, worth noting that they usually advance more and more until the next crisis hits, or the relations of production are pulled forward, revolution, and the problem is solved. There's much more depth to go into here, but unfortunately, this is leagues more compared to the average Twitter Marxist and will more than suffice for our purpose. I will begin by stating the best time to do so, then move on to the later date where arguing against this change is inexcusable. In other words, in relation to the question of when do the relations of production, the mode of production, when does that need to advance or catch up? So, when is the ideal time to advance the relations of production? The moment you can. Once you have the conditions needed to do so, just do it. Anyone who read Foundations of Leninism will be able to tell you the line we take on building a Chinese wall between the first stage of the revolution, which is bourgeois democratic, and the second one, socialist and led by the proletariat. Quoting Stalin, Foundations of Leninism, quote, "The heroes of the Second International asserted, and continue to assert, that between the bourgeois democratic revolution and the proletarian revolution, there is a chasm, or at any rate a Chinese wall, separating one from the other by a more or less protracted interval of time, during which the bourgeoisie, having come into power, develops capitalism, while the proletariat accumulates strength and prepares for the future decisive struggle against capitalism. This interval is usually calculated to extend over many decades, if not longer. It scarcely needs proof that this Chinese wall theory is totally devoid of scientific meaning under the conditions of imperialism, that it is, and can only be, a means of concealing and camouflaging the counter-revolutionary aspirations of the bourgeoisie." Okay, so don't wait any longer than you have to. That's the end of the quote. What is often misunderstood, however, is that even communist parties which have secured state power can still make this mistake, turning themselves from communists into opportunists in the process. In 1921, Lenin wrote, "Both the anarchists and the petty bourgeois Democrats, i.e. the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, who are the Russian counterparts of the international social type, have talked and are still talking an incredible lot of nonsense about the relation between the bourgeois democratic revolution and the socialist, that is, proletarian, revolution. The last 4 years have proved to the hilt that our interpretation of Marxism on this point and our estimate of the experience of former revolutions were correct. We have consummated the bourgeois democratic revolution as nobody had done before. We are advancing toward the socialist revolution consciously, firmly, and unswervingly, knowing that it is not separated from the bourgeois democratic revolution by a Chinese wall, and knowing too that in the last analysis, struggle alone will determine how far we shall advance, what part of this immense and lofty task we shall accomplish, and to what extent we shall succeed in consolidating our victories. Time will show. But we even see now that a tremendous amount, tremendous for this ruined, exhausted, and backward country, has already been done toward the socialist transformation of society. In other words, that's the end of that quote. In other words, the Soviet people must build up the basis to adopt socialism as soon as possible. Lenin explained the reason for this very, very clearly. Quoting Lenin, the tax in kind, capitalism is a bane compared with socialism. Capitalism is a boon compared with medievalism, small production, and the evils of bureaucracy which spring from the dispersal of the small producers. Unquote. I think that there's also a relevant quote here, and I forget which work it's from, but basically Lenin's saying that if you're still... So in the class struggle under capitalism, you want to advocate for whatever civil rights you can get for the purpose of making the class struggle easier. But as soon as socialist revolution becomes possible, continuing to cling to the system of bourgeois democratic civil rights is actually reactionary because you have the opportunity to go forward. So as soon as you can do that, you do that. And again, how ironic that this, randomly chosen metaphor of the Chinese wall would end up actually being applied in China. Next point, when can the absence of such transition, ahead through social revolution, be used to detect a reactionary state? It's when a crisis of production occurs. We ought to advance the relations of production beforehand, not only to avoid the crisis, but to enjoy faster growth. But if a certain state and its rulers prefer to experience such a crisis over advancing the relations of production, it can only be a dictatorship of an exploiting minority. Like, that's the only motive they would have to do that. They resist it because doing away with the old exploiting relations of production will be doing away with them. A dictatorship of the workers will not arrive into such a situation because the change to the relations of production will either crush a remnant of exploitation and move us a step closer to socialism, or, if we've already arrived there, because exploitation was already done away with and the state belongs to the people, and the people have no interest in resisting this advance. The few elements which still resist this step do not control the state, hence they cannot stop it. Quoting again from Stalin, Economic Problems of the USSR, how then are the words full conformity to be understood? They are to be understood as meaning that under socialism, things do not usually go to the length of a conflict between the relations of production and the productive forces, that society is in a position to take timely steps to bring the lagging relations of production into conformity with the character of the productive forces. Socialist society is in a position to do so because it does not include the obsolescent classes that might organize resistance. Of course, even under socialism, there will be backward, inert forces that do not realize the necessity for changing the relations of production, but they, of course, will not be difficult to overcome without bringing matters to a conflict. Unquote. And the last page. For reference, the below paragraph is written in early 2022, less than 2 weeks since 2021. In China, 2009, there was a massive economic crisis that affected the weakest the most. This is part of the global financial crisis, 2008 and all that. Consider that this crisis never had to happen, and these people never had to suffer because of it. This was not a natural, unavoidable tragedy. It was a crime. The Chinese bourgeoisie enriched themselves on the backs of the Chinese workers. Worse still, the gross domestic product per adult and national income per adult continued to grow. Where did all this wealth go then if it was not sucked out of China? Here, to those who never needed to, quote, recover, but instead grew and continue to grow. It is obvious to all that even a mockery of the NEP, executed by amateurs, would not have yielded such results. Comrades, this is not socialism, socialist construction, an NEP, or any other excuse to be found. This is late-stage capitalism. This is imperialism. This is the face of reaction. We will be nothing short of class traitors should we backstab our Chinese comrades by supporting their exploiters. We must unite with the Chinese workers against imperialism everywhere and reaction everywhere. An injury to one is an injury to all. Without an uncompromising war for the truth, a war to expose deception meant to disarm us, to set us against one another, only utopians will believe in a course to socialism. Our theory is a guide for action, a guide to achieve the liberation of workers everywhere, liberty from exploitation and poverty, war and deceit. The murderous propagandists of NATO may try to set us against ourselves, while the revisionist social democrats wish for us to make peace and bend the knee to our class enemies. Only with the teachings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, only by the uncompromising struggle for liberty, may we bring to life our call for unity. Workers of the world unite.